discussing today. Briefly talk about the importance of pollinators and then get an awesome look at the diversity of native bees. Talk a little bit about the worries we have about the decline of pollinators and why, what are the threats to their populations, and finally get to what we can do about it, conserving bees at home and in our communities. I cannot stress enough the keystone role that pollinators play. Over 85%, and some publications say 90%, of flowering plants require an animal to pollinate them to reproduce. That pollinator is usually an insect. So it's thanks to these insects, thanks to the bees, that we have pretty much all of the terrestrial ecosystems that exist on Earth. Imagine for a moment, if you will, what this Earth would look like with 85% of the vegetation not available to sustain the rest of life on Earth. What about for us? Well, we like to eat, and it turns out that pollinators are really important for human nutrition. They enable plants to produce the fruits and seeds that we like to eat. About 35% of crop production globally is due to the efforts of pollinators. This amounts to a lot of money, so towards our economy, over $20 billion of crops in the United States, and that's over 200 billion worldwide. The food that we eat, thanks to pollinators, is some of the most nutritious food that we can obtain. Most of our vitamins and minerals come thanks to bees. And when you break it down, about 1 out of every 3 mouthfuls of food and drink that we consume, again, is thanks to bees. So here we've got a little picture of a produce section. This happens to be Whole Foods. Nice selection. I might want to do my shopping here. Thank you, bees. This is what it looks like without the bees. Not a place where I would want to shop for my produce. And most people don't realize that dairy is also dependent on bees. So for those of you who eat dairy, there are little bees, alkali bees, that enable us to grow alfalfa, which supports the dairy industry. This is what the typical dairy section looks like. Thank you, bees. And this is what it looks like without bees. So a really large change in what would be available to us nutritionally without bees doing the work that they do. And as far as everybody else, that is non-humans, everything is dependent on that foundation of plants, which in turn are dependent on the bees to pollinate them. They enable the reproduction of many plant species, and then these plants provide food, fruits, seeds, etc., for insects and for other wildlife. And also insects and wildlife use the plants for nesting material and shelter. So again, the absolute foundation of terrestrial ecosystems is thanks to pollinators. Pollinators are diverse. I just want to point that out. We're going to focus mostly on bees today, but I did want to show you that there are other kinds of pollinators around. Most pollinators are insects, and you can see here there's quite a variety. Here's some butterflies and moths. Here are some beetles. Here are some wasps, and here are some flies. And I know vitamins and minerals are really important, but even more important, we wouldn't have chocolate if it wasn't for a little fly pollinator. So thank you for that. We might also remember that there are some vertebrates that act as pollinators. These include hummingbirds and bats. So now I am going to turn it over to Aimee to show us the amazing diversity of bees. Take it away.
Thank you, Debbie. I don't know if I want to follow you. You're so smooth. She said she was tired this afternoon. So yes, our pollinators are diverse, but even if we just try to hone in and simplify and just look at our bees, in the US, we have over 3,600 species of bees. So it's not that simple, right? Obviously, everyone, we think about our honeybees. Our European honeybees are cornerstone of a lot of our crops. But actually, if you look at these European honeybees, they are dramatically different than the vast majority of our native bees. I can switch it, Debbie. Sorry, I'm gonna have to move back 1 second. Okay, thanks, sorry. Our honeybees are in huge colonies, thousands of worker bees, a single queen. They overwinter together as a group. But then take a look at those native bees. Almost all of our native bees are solitary, other than the bumblebees, which are in small colonies. And the other thing about our native bees is they're so diverse. We have huge ones that can be almost 2 inches in size. Tiny ones are just a few millimeters in size. I'm going to run through a few beautiful photographs of our native bees just to kind of give you a little perspective. You know, oftentimes when we talk about our native bees, we think about the bumblebees as kind of the panda bears of the invertebrate world, right? Because they're just so darn cute. So here's a gorgeous bumblebee. If you're in Eugene and a lot of places in the country, right now you're going to be seeing your queen bumblebees out right now. And they are the biggest ones that you'll see. They are working hard. They are going to feed their young. They're going to lay their eggs and feed their young and do it all. So this is a large carpenter bee, about the same size as a bumblebee, but notice it doesn't have all the fuzz on it. And here's one of our tiny, small carpenter bees. We got lots of different sweat bees, right? Some of them are spectacular, like this bright neon green one. I love this. And here's this great combination where it's got this striped yellow and black, but the green up top. Minor bees are super precious and super sweet. They nest in the ground. They're solitary. This is Longhorn bees are probably one of my favorite bees. You'll see these guys out in the late summer. Look on your blanket flowers or sunflowers, and they're called Longhorns obviously because they have those huge long antennae. Just a few other types, sunflower bees. We actually even have parasitic bees. Leafcutter is another really cool one. It's hard to tell, but our honeybees and a lot of bees collect their pollen on their back legs. If you look at this, you can actually see that the leafcutter bee collect the pollen on their abdomen. That's where you see the pollen on this bee. Leafcutter bees also tell a great story because, as you can see, they are exactly what they are called. They cut leaves and they line their nest with those leaves. So great, we got 3,600 species of bees in the nation. Here in Oregon, we have about 500 or 600 species of bees. I can't tell you for all the other places from Alaska to Massachusetts, the exact numbers. Thank you all for being here. But if we take that broad swath of all those bees and we divide them out by where they live, we can think a lot more simply. We've got ground nesting bees. That's about 70% of our native bees. We have, and we've got tunnel nesting bees that are going to be in pithy plants or maybe in a dead tree, and they're about 30% of our bees. And then we have 48 species of bumblebees that are in the US and Canada, and they live in small colonies, as I mentioned a moment ago. So here is a crazy bumblebee colony, not at all like that honeybee colony that's so very exacting. Bumblebees are a lot messier. They also are going to be in a much smaller colony. So I mentioned honeybees can be thousands of bees, sometimes up to 40,000 workers all together. Bumblebees, you're going to see maybe 30 or 40 bees. At the high end is going to be 300 or 400 bees in a bumblebee colony. And unlike those honeybees that overwinter as a whole colony, only a new queen is going to overwinter, and then she's going to start a new colony the next year. So then we got our ground nesting bees. As I said, they're about 70% of bees are ground nesting. It looks like an ant nest. You would never know that this is actually where a solitary bee is going to live. And she's going to have, and a single female is going to provision that nest. And those eggs are going to overwinter underground there. And if you want to be looking for them, look in sandy, loamy areas, look in dry places that are well drained. You might very well see some bees. And then tunnel nesting bees, this is exactly why I don't cut my raspberries back, because you're going to have bees overwintering in these pithy plants in your yard, your roses, your berries. You could very well find, if you break one open, you might very well see them. And if you trim off the top of some plants, we'll talk about that in solutions. Debbie will talk about that. Preview, sorry. So the thing that's great about all of these native bees is they can be a part of our communities, and they need to be a part of our communities, because the next thing we're going to talk about is the devastating decline that we're seeing in so many of these bees. And this picture is actually out of Portland, Oregon. There is a school, and they actually have made what they call the ticklebees. A small ground nesting bee has become their school mascot. And every spring, the kids go out and explore and appreciate these amazing bees. So they really can be part of our community. And as I said, we want to make sure they are more a part of our communities than they already are, because we're seeing declines. You know, there's a lot we don't know about the decline of our native pollinators and of our bees, but what we do know is very concerning. So if you look at those 48 species of bumblebees in the US and Canada, more than 1/4 of them are at risk of extinction. Others in that group are also in decline, but not yet to critical or concerning levels. I'm going to quickly jump over to our our butterflies as well, even though we're going to mostly focus on bees. A lot of our butterflies are also in decline. Something that is concerning with our butterflies is that it's not just bees that are in small ecosystems where that ecosystem is being broken down. These are widespread butterflies that are also in decline as well. If you look at the 800 species of butterflies that we have here in the United States, about 1/5 of them, 19%, are at risk of extinction. So these are significant amounts that have pretty dramatic declines. And obviously, probably getting the most news are our monarchs. So a lot of you probably know, a lot of you are in areas where you've got eastern monarchs that move and overwinter in Mexico. Over here on the West Coast, we actually also have monarchs that are going to overwinter on the Southern California coast. Both of these groups of monarchs are in decline. Our eastern monarch is in decline by over 80%. Here on the West Coast, it's even more dire. We actually are looking at more than a 99% decline in our monarchs that overwinter in California, the migratory monarchs. So it went from over 10 million in the 80s to this last year, we had less than 2,000 that Xerces Society volunteers were able to count. The year before, we counted about 30,000. So we're very concerned. One good thing is you'll see there is some crossover between the different areas, and we are hoping that we can get some crossover where monarchs are going to move back over to the west. There's a lot still unknown though. So, all right. So I'm going to turn it back over to Debbie, and she's going to talk about some of the threats that our pollinators face, because it's really important. If we're going to understand that decline, we need to know what's causing that harm so we can make corrections.
Thank you, Aimee. And again, not such happy stuff to talk about, but there are many threats to pollinator populations, to wildlife in general. And unfortunately, these threats interact to make the problem even worse. So I'm just going to go through them pretty briefly here. Most biodiversity is on the decline due to habitat loss, and that is certainly true for our bee pollinators. Many bees and insects in general are being affected by climate change. Disease and non-native species, which either compete with or carry additional disease to our native species, are causing population declines. And finally, our use and overuse of pesticides is seriously causing the decline of populations of pollinators. So just a few brief words about them. This map is giving you a feel for how much of the Earth's land surface has been affected by human development. And wherever this development occurs, we are taking away habitat that supports biodiversity, including bees. So as we use habitat for our own purposes, to live, to work, to grow food, to support the burgeoning population of the Earth, we're taking away habitat from the bees. We're also adding impervious surfaces where vegetation and pollinators simply cannot grow. So biggest problem, they need resources, they need a place for their populations to thrive, and that's getting harder and harder for them to find. Just to kind of illustrate these huge swaths of habitat that are being basically plowed for food. This is a picture of that. We do have a lot of problems with the way that we practice agriculture, and this does directly affect pollinator populations. Part of it is the loss of habitat. Part of it is the fact that we're now changing a rich habitat into a monoculture, which does not support a great diversity of bees. And it turns out that this isn't good for the farmers, because the greater the diversity of bees that are pollinating in the crop fields, the greater the yield that the farmers have. So it really behooves farmers to think about how to solve this problem. And some of the solutions are really not that hard to implement. So here's just kind of a picture of what we want things to look like. have our farms where we're growing crops, but make sure that there are parts of that farm that are devoted to the growing of flowering plants to support the bees. This is a win-win situation. The bees are supported, their populations can thrive, and the farmers do better because they've got the pollinators working for them to increase their crop yield. In addition, these flower fields support other insects which actually act in pest control so that the farmers have less need of chemicals to control pests and again, greater yield. So a win-win section, you take a very small portion of the farms and maybe don't devote that to crop farming, but devote it to the pollinators, and you're going to have a better crop yield overall. Invasives are a problem for a number of different kinds of species. Invasive plants are reducing by outcompeting available native plants. And because the native bees have been co-evolving with the native plants for so many millions of years, they're best at getting their resources from native plants. They're not that supported by some of the invasives that are now all around us. In addition, we introduce invasive insects into areas where they didn't live before, and these insects may outcompete our native bees and pass diseases. People have been studying them. I'm not going to read this out to you, but I just wanted to let you know that this is an area of interest, ecological impacts of invasive alien species on bees, and you can see that they're looking at both the impact on native plants and the impact on the bees themselves and the pathogens that are carried to bees. There are a number of different kinds of pathogens that cause disease in bees. These include viruses, fungi, mites, etc. Unfortunately, bees are pretty good at passing pathogens from one to another. So flowers, which are usually so positive for the bees, can actually act as breeding grounds for disease. As a diseased insect visits a flower, it might leave some pathogen behind. The next bee comes in to pollinate there, and they're going to pick up these pathogens and get diseases. And this can be somewhat of a problem with our managed bees because they are more prone to different kinds of diseases. The managed bees go into the fields. Again, they leave these disease organisms and our native bees pick them up. So it's something that we do need to pay attention to. And climate change. There's so many effects of climate change on pollinators and other wildlife. Just to kind of give you a feel for a little bit of that, changes in temperature affect pollinator survival, their growth, their reproduction. It impacts their behavior, their flight activity, their foraging patterns, how much food they can get, and it actually causes physiological changes. They lose body fat, which they really need to sustain themselves. In addition, climate change, even when it's not working on the bees themselves, it's working on the plants, and it's actually changing the plants that are available to the bees, their quantity, their quality, and the diversity of plants. As we know, climate change is causing range shifts for a lot of different species, and we don't really know which species are going to be okay with this. They're going to be able to move into another area that's still suitable for them, and which species won't be able to keep up. There was some concerning research in a few species of bees where they were able to, so here's the range of the bees, and they were able to document that the range was moving northward because it was just too hot in the south from global warming effects. But unfortunately, they found that the northward end of the range wasn't moving at all. So what you see is this shrinking of the habitat available to the bees. Phenology refers to timing in biology, and phenology is changing because things are warming up quickly, and we don't know if the timing is going to be coordinated. So for example, plants might be emerging a little bit earlier than they usually did. Are the bees going to emerge in time to take advantage of the resources that they've been taking advantage of through evolutionary time? One study looked at a few species of bumblebees, and they looked at different days of mismatch. So say the bees and the plants were not emerging at exactly the same time. How thrown off would the bees be? They found that even a 3-day mismatch in terms of when the flowers were available and when the bees emerged, only 3 days, caused collapse of those bumblebee populations. So it's really important to get the timing right. And again, we don't know which species are going to be impacted by this and which ones won't. So climate change has large effects on pollinators, and unfortunately, it acts with other stressors to make things worse. Climate change causes a reduction in habitat suitability, less floral resources, more intense climate events, storms, floods, etc., and drought. We know that drought acts directly on the food supply for the bees. For example, during droughts, there's less flowers, but the flowers that do produce pollen, the pollen's just not as nutritious for the bees. It doesn't have as many fatty lipids and proteins, so the bees are not as well supported. And in addition, climate change is moving around organisms a little bit more, which means carrying more invasive species and diseases. So we want to start paying attention to these threats so we can figure out the best way to help the bees. And the last threat that we're going to talk about, May, let us know about pesticides.
Thank you, Debbie. So yeah, the last threat is the concerns of pesticides. And quickly, the first thing I always like to clarify is when I use the term pesticide, I'm using it as an umbrella term. So underneath that umbrella, it includes insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides. So just a lot of times people think of pesticide and insecticide as synonymous when insecticides are actually a type of pesticide, at least as far as federal regulation goes, you know. So obviously people think of insecticides as the main concern. That's what's you're gonna see an outright death immediate from potentially from an application of an insecticide if the bee was present. But all the fungicides, herbicides, many of these other pesticides also have various concerns, and we want to be aware of those as well. Let's see if I'm having a little lag on my move. 1 second. There we go. So today we have, you know, another 10, 15 minutes, which means that I'm not going to get a broad overview of pesticides. I'm going to give you a couple high level things to be thinking about when you're in your home garden or when you're managing for pests in and around where you live. First thing I want you to think about is that it's not about using pesticides according to the label. Even a legal use of pesticides can cause harm. We're talking about species that are in decline, that are extremely sensitive to some of these chemicals. If we truly want to bring back the pollinators, we want to both help them maintain and thrive and be restored, we need to go beyond just using a pesticide according to the label. The next big overarching picture or thought I want to bring to everyone is most people are looking at direct contact, right? They're thinking about, I'm not going to spray a pesticide when I'm going to be spraying a bee. If I spray the bee, that's when I'm going to cause harm. But there's actually a number of other concerns and ways that bees can be exposed. The next, probably more obvious one is you spray a plant, that chemical is still active on that plant, and a bee comes to visit and they forage and they are exposed to the chemical. But let's go back to our native bees. Let's go to that awesome little leafcutter bee that I showed you. That bee that's going to be gathering a piece of leaf that might have been sprayed, and they're going to line their nest, and then they're going to lay their eggs there. Both that bee and also all their offspring potentially could be exposed. Then we go to those ground nesting bees, right? These bees so if there's treated seed being planted, if there's an application that's occurring where there's runoff or drip onto that soil can be contaminated. And again, these are bees that are going to be underground throughout the year. So it's not just about a bloom time avoidance. I think probably the big topic of right now is systemic insecticides, right? There's a growing number of our insecticides, the newer insecticides are systemic. That means they're uptaken by the plant and they can potentially be moved through that plant and be expressed in pollen and nectar. So that gives a direct exposure route to bees. If that's a chemical that's highly toxic, that could be harming that bee or their bee's offspring. So that the big overarching there is that one, so it's not just about avoiding misuse of a chemical and following the label, and it's not just about not spraying a flower that's in bloom because other exposure routes are there. Just going to wrap up the threat section with the same thing that Debbie started with, because I know I need to hear things multiple times these days. These are all interacting. So if you have a bee that's been exposed to a pesticide, they're using all of their energy resources to detoxify from that pesticide potentially. That means they might not have the resources available to fight off a disease or to fly the extra distance they need to fly in order to go forage. Same goes the other way. If they have to forage further and further away from their nest, they're using up their energy reserves, less likely to fight off pesticides, pathogens, other things. So these are all things that work together. So let's get to the good news. Phew! Debbie and I are excited to be here. The beauty of all of this is that, yes, our bees are in decline. Yes, there are many threats, but we each in our home garden can actually make a difference. We can, in a very short amount of time, bring back these pollinators. One of my favorite stories happened a couple of years ago when I pulled out some turf, and I literally pulled out like 3 feet of turf because it was growing over from another neighbor's into one of my beds. The next week, I saw polyester bees, an awesome little ground nesting bee, creating a nest there. It was like 1 week later. And granted, it is a south face. It is well drained. It is sandy. It's all the things it should be for a ground nesting bee. But that's all it took. So we can do this. The other thing, and we can do it at home. So a lot of conservation is very far away. It takes a long time. It almost feels impossible to be able to achieve. But many of our native bees, they only fly a couple hundred yards. So that means our backyard and our neighborhood is enough to provide. If we offer them everything they need, they can survive just there. They don't need anything more than our little backyard. Last item on urban, the importance of our urban for our pollinators. I think a lot of people wouldn't think about this, but stable areas are actually more valuable for providing abundance and diversity for our bees. So granted, there's temporary habitat is wonderful, flowers for a short time, you know, your garden where you leave things to bloom, you can provide food, but when you have long-term permanent habitat that is stable, you're going to bring back every year, you're going to see an increase in the diversity that's there because more bees are coming. That's something that our urban areas have that a lot of other landscapes don't necessarily have. Sorry, I have a little bit of a lag. So I'm going to talk about one of the first pieces of things to think about when you are gardening at home in order to protect those bees from those threats that we discussed. And then Debbie actually gets to talk about all the more fun components of how to garden for pollinators. So obviously I would talk about the concerns that pesticides pose. So when you're at your home garden, what are the big, again, broad brushstroke thoughts about what you can do to avoid using pesticides? And I'm actually going to ask Crystal if she would drop in the chat. There's a link to a home garden fact sheet about kind of what are the steps you can take to manage pests without pesticides. There's also a link to a webinar that you could watch that goes through, actually helps you know how to identify pests and beneficials in your yard in order to avoid pesticide use and manage them without pesticides. So broad brushstroke thoughts here, right? Plants are just like humans. If you feed us the right things, if you get the amount of rest you need, you get exercise, you're going to be more resilient. So if you have the right soil for your plants, if you put them in the right place, you give them the right amount of sunlight and water, they're going to be healthy, they're going to be more resilient, they're going to be able to fight off pests. Oftentimes, it is the plants that are most stressed that are going to be responding and actually at risk from pests. The other thing is, let's step back and reevaluate what a pest is. You know, an ant in our garden is actually doing good things. Most of those ants are actually moving soil and a value. They're a bit of a nuisance in the house, unless they're carpenter ant, and then we have to take a step back and think more. But most of the insects that we're going to find in our garden, they estimates say that less than 1% of the insects that you're going to find in your yard are going to even be a pest. And even those few insects that might be a problem, they're probably not at levels that are of a problem. So again, just like our own immune systems, we need our immune system to be woken up every once in a while with a cold, not with COVID. I'm happy to be in a Zoom call with you all right now. But a small cold, a small pest infestation on a plant actually triggers that plant's immune system. So even at small levels of pests are actually beneficial in your yard. Also, those pests feed a lot of the beneficial insects. So there's another value to them. And lastly, tolerate some damage. Remember that leafcutter bee. Think about that monarch on your milkweed, all those very hungry caterpillars. They're in your yard eating and using it. If you see your plants have been nibbled on, great. You're supporting the diversity of insects that we want out there. Like, you want that activity. It's a value. So, all right, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie to talk about all the other components of gardening that we want to think about for our pollinators.
Aimee, did you want to say something about the Be Safe program?
I did. I'm not done, you guys. I lied. I thought that was my last slide. So there are a lot of hidden concerns with pesticides in our garden as well. I'm not going to go into all of them, but you know, movement from other places. But one of the things we do that's had a lot of media coverage is that nursery plants can be contaminated with pesticides. And this is a reality that the research is showing. When nursery plants are collected and tested, we often find multiple pesticides, sometimes at levels that can be of harm. And part of this is because we have more and more longer lived pesticides that are out there. So if you want to make sure that your plants are pollinator friendly, we're really urging folks to start dialogues with their nurseries and trying to move forward. Sorry, I have a delay. All right, here we go. Have that dialogue with your nursery. Talk about, you know, what are the management practices at your nursery? Are neonicotinoids being used on these nursery plants? Do you practice more pollinator friendly practices? You know, what's happening in that nursery? Do you sell organic nursery stock? It does exist, it's not common. And if you want to learn more about how it is to find these nursery plants, I'm going to ask Crystal again to stick a couple of links up in the chat. I also had we also have a few links for different pesticide resources if people want to look at those. So just one last plug to think about how to make sure the plants that you're bringing into your garden, when they're in your garden, don't have residual chemicals on it that could be causing harm to the very species that you want to protect.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like we've got a great head start on protecting bees in our own backyard. And I'm just going to say a few things about other things we want to keep in mind when we are considering planting for bees. And remember, we can do this on any scale you want. Go big, or maybe just take a very small patch of your yard to start with and make a little bit of a pocket of native pollinator plants. By all of us doing a little something, we're going to provide the resources that these guys need to exist and to thrive and to help us out with their pollination services. So some things to consider: planting groupings if you can, rather than single flowers. Think of bees flitting from patch to patch. Plant flowers that will bloom throughout the season. So think about getting early bloomers and late bloomers so that you're supporting different species of bees. We have early emerging spring bees. We have bees that live in the middle of the summer, and also so that you're supporting bees who have a longer lifespan and exist throughout the spring and summer. They need resources at all stages of their life. There are lots of handy charts available. We'll put a link in there in the chat for you. So you can get these pretty tables that tell you what are some native plants in the area, when do they bloom, and then just play a little bit. It's like going to a buffet. Pick some early bloomers, some middle bloomers, some late bloomers, and you'll have a lovely, diverse garden that supports the bees throughout their season. One thing that you might want to think about avoiding is some of the cultivated plant varieties. Unfortunately, they look really pretty, but many of them, particularly the double petal varieties, do not offer resources to the bees. So they don't provide nectar or pollen. So sure, if you want to have some pretty flowers that you really love in your yard, that's fine, but try and remember to plant something that will support the bees. And what will support the bees? Well, the answer is native plants for native bees. So anywhere in your yard, in your flower pot, on your patio, in your garden, think about putting in some native bloomers. Native pollinators have been co-evolving with their native plants for millions of years. They're the best adapted to both helping the plants to reproduce and getting the resources they need from the plants. And of course, native plants are, in a way, the easiest thing for us to grow. They're the most adapted to local conditions. Because of that, they rarely get pest problems. They need less water and they need less chemicals to support them, chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides. So native plants basically means more native bees. Finally, if there are kids listening in on this, go clean your room. But for the rest of us, get messy. Bees really do appreciate messiness in the yard. Please control any urge you have to clean up, or at least don't clean up too much, because bees can use bare patches of soil and twigs that are lying around in stems and leaf litter and brush piles and snags and stumps. Especially try and resist cleaning up too early. I know we're all excited about getting things into our garden, and the time is coming when we will be able to do so, but there might still be bees overwintering in the ground or in your leaf piles or in piles of sticks, hollowed out stems from last year's plants. Generally, the rule of thumb is to wait till temperatures are consistently over 50 degrees, and we're kind of back and forth now, cooler nights and warmer days. So if you can resist cleaning up a little bit, or at least clean some areas but leave other areas messy, that will really help the bees that are still overwintering. We want to provide food for the bees, but let's remember also that they have other needs for their reproductive and life cycle. So let's think a little bit about shelter. Try and identify and protect any areas that you might have in your yard that provide sites for nesting and overwintering. That means, again, keeping some mess, keeping some stems, some leaf litter, tussocks or piles of grass and brush and piles. You'll find them in rock piles and snags and stumps. You can deadhead flowers, and that helps the plant reproducing, but it also helps those stem nesters that Aimee showed us before. So keep some of that mess around. It really does help to provide this shelter for the bees. And just some specifics relating it back to the diversity of bees that we saw earlier. If you want to encourage ground nesters, please leave some of your yard and your garden undisturbed. Let a little dirt shine through. You just need small patches of this dirt, and that means, at least in some places, avoid overuse of landscape fabric and heavy mulching so that some bare soil exists. That's what the ground nesters need to dig into. For other nesters, those who are tunnel nesters, think about pithy stem species and maybe grow some of those. I know we've already mentioned raspberries, and there's wild rose and elderberry and aster and goldenrod and cane fruit. This is again where deadheading, cutting provides easy access to these tunnels for the bees. Leave snags and leave brush piles and piles of twigs around, because you'll often find tunnel nesters in there. And finally, provide sources of water or mud. Many people keep mason bees, and mason bees, in order to do their masonry work, they need to work with mud. And sometimes we have some dry springs. So take a little bit of water, pour it into a bare soil patch, and the bee will mix it up and do some masonry work. And water works for a lot of different pollinators in many different ways besides masonry. So do try and keep some water around. That can mean you just have a little rock garden with some water in it. You can just take an old tray, maybe put some pebbles in it and fill it up with water now and then. This provides clean water for drinking, for nest building, for cooling, for some bees, for diluting stored honey, and for butterfly puddling. So provide some sources of clean water. So we've got food, foraging, floral resources. We've got shelter, we've got water. What are some other considerations for bees? Think about the light in your garden, and we should be thinking about this as a community as a whole, because as you can see, there is a lot of light pollution. This is what it looked like in 2012, and these maps in the bottom right here sort of are giving you an idea of how much more light pollution we are suffering. It's not good for us. It's not good for most wildlife. There have been a number of studies that show that light at night really interferes with the ability of animals to successfully reproduce, to avoid predation, to find food, etc. And we know specifically that light pollution does harm beneficial insects and also migratory birds. From one study, nocturnal pollinator visits to plants were reduced by 62% in areas with light pollution compared to dark areas. So this is a significant effect on how many pollinators we're going to have. So what can you do about it in your own yard? Think about your lighting. Turn off unnecessary lights. When you have them, switch to amber or red colored lights. Avoid the blue end of the spectrum. Use the lights only when they're needed. So think about installing motion sensors or setting a timer so they're on for security when you're outside and need them at night, but they're off when they're not needed. Keep indoor lights indoors. That's so simple. Just close your curtains and your blinds. And finally, if you have light for security in your garden, yard, walkway, that's great, but check to make sure that it's shielded on top and that the light points downward. It's the light that spills upwards that's distracting to most flying things, migratory birds, insects, and other kinds of wildlife. So we can do something about too much light pollution interfering with the ability of the pollinators to do their job. So what should your yard provide if it's going to be considered habitat? Floral resources, grow lots of native flowers. Grow them in different sizes and shapes and colors and that bloom throughout the season. Provide shelter for nesting and overwintering, and that could be a bare patch of soil, a twig, a messy area in your yard, and provide protection from pesticides. What else can we do? Even if you're not working in your own yard, or in fact, if you are, there are several local organizations that have pollinator projects. You can join, for example, with the city's parks and open spaces to help them to plant and maintain native habitat. Right here in our community and in any community that you're in, there are always opportunities. The more help that parks and open spaces get from volunteers, the more they're able to maintain that native habitat without the use of pesticides. There are other things we can do. Remember to vote and contact your legislators to support pollinator-friendly legislation. And we encourage everybody to engage in community science. And we'll talk in just a moment about a way that you can do that right here in Eugene coming up this month. The more we know about where the bees are, which bees are there, which bees might be declining in a particular area, the more we know what we need to do to help them. So please engage in community science so we can figure out the best way to help the bees. And finally, raise awareness. Most people don't even think about bees and how important they are and how they are threatened right now. This recent article published just this year, I kind of like the name of it, No Buzz for Bees. So they checked out 10 million stories that had been published in newspapers, etc. And they found that 0.007% of those stories address pollinator decline. That means not enough people are in the know, but we can help that. Help raise awareness, spread the word. We've got lots of resources for you at our Bee City Eugene website. You can see a recap of some of what we talked about in this video. That's put up by the Xerces Society, and I think that maybe we'll throw that into the chat as well. And let's engage in a new program that's spreading across the globe. It's pretty popular in Britain. It was started by a plant life organization. Xerces Society in Bee City, USA is promoting it here in the United States. Mow May. So in Mow May, the point of that is don't mow in May so that you allow the grass to grow. That allows a lot of little wildflowers, often what we consider weeds, little flowers in May to become available to all these bees that are emerging and going about their business. This creates habitat and forage for these early season pollinators, and it doesn't get too out of control if you don't mow for just a month. Consider weeds as not being horribly ugly things, but as being little flowers that support bees. We can all make this happen again just by working together as a community to create these friendly neighborhood places for bees. So I encourage people to look into the Mow May program. Join us here at Bee City. We're really happy to have you with us today. We're really happy to share our enthusiasm for bees and to work together to support them. We have a few things coming up that I just want to make people aware of. On Wednesday, April 28th at about noon, We're going to have our annual bee count. We've done this for a few years, so it's a way for us to track how the bees are doing in this location. And I'll show you a map of that in a moment. We'll have a second bee count on Wednesday, May 5th at a different area in Eugene, and it'll be fun to compare the results of this community science. We have a couple of webinars coming up, Bees and Soil, with a focus on regenerative agriculture and how that matters to bees. And then coming in June, we will be joined by Kelsey Irvine and August Jackson for a talk on native plants and native bees. And you'll see lots and lots of examples of these in June when lots of things are blooming and buzzing around. This is an announcement again of our 4th annual bee survey, and we're going to post a link to that in the chat so you guys have information. You can register for that and join us. And this map just gives you an idea of where that's located. And finally, I just want to say that I'm so happy you joined us here today, because this is one of the few areas where we really all can come together as a community, work together to really make a difference, and do so only by doing a little bit on each of us, just to kind of help the whole world. Seems like it might be worth it. So help us to support bees. Thanks so much for being here today. We're going to stick around and answer any questions that you have. And again, we want to thank you for your interest in bees.
Wow, thank you so much, Deb. That was amazing. I learned a lot during that presentation, and wow, no Mow May. I cannot wait to have that conversation with my partner and see how that goes. So I have one before we jump into all the really awesome questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much, and please feel free to keep throwing questions in the Q&A, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. I have a quick question about no Mow May. Do you mow up until the last day of April and then just don't mow at all in May? Or maybe you could go out with a line trimmer and just trim some of the taller pieces like as they grow out of control through May? Or what might be your guidelines leading up to no Mow May?
The thinking is that the less often that you mow, the more diversity and the more support you're providing, because again, it's a little bit more stable. So I think the no Mow May was to give a good chunk. And I saw one question pop up about the mower height. And another piece is you can also have your mower height be higher. That's also helpful for the grass and beneficial, but not to the same degree as taking good chunks of time where you don't mow. So if your partner's not ready to go full no Mow May, you could mow once, or basically spread out that mowing as infrequent as you possibly can in order to create more stability and more time when there's forage for your bees and other pollinators.
Originally, I think the rule of thumb that was out there was really try to only mow once a month. So this was a way of kind of choosing a month where there were a lot of native bloomers and bees, and choose that month, have that month break between mowing. So, yeah, let's do it. Let's work. What else?
All right.
Besides mow, we might find something interesting to do in the garden.
And then it's leave the leaves in the fall, right? Because you got to leave the leaves so that, all of those bumblebees that are going to be looking for tucky places to tuck, and all the other amazing species that are going to use those leaves to overwinter when butterfly species. You got to leave the leaves in the fall and no mow in May.
All right. I will report back to you on how that goes, but I'm going to try and do that. So without further ado, I really want to get through some of these amazing questions in the Q&A. Thank you everybody for filling up our Q&A for us. So I'm just going to jump right in from the first one to the last one, and we're going to get through as many as we can. Our very first question today comes from an anonymous attendee, and they say, carpenter bees get a bad rep, in my opinion. How can people be taught to live alongside them? I always suggest taking a new untreated 2x4 and drilling holes in it to attract carpenter bees to it. Are there any other suggestions you have? Any other ways to discourage their drilling into wood sidings and etc.? Deb, Aimee, what might y'all say to this attendee that asked this question?
Well, I agree that they get a bad rep. And one of the things you can, so I guess the two-part, one thing, if you want people to better appreciate them, they're so fun to watch. I mean, the way they, especially the large carpenter bees. So there's actually a lot of great videos on carpenter bees, and they actually show the large carpenter bee's nest, which is really a long, skinny nest. It's not like, carpenter bees aren't like carpenter ants and termites, and even they move pretty slow, but it's just a single nest that they're creating. So one thing is to look at a video of what the nest looks like. But then if you really do also want to deter them, because there are places in your home that you don't want them to be burrowing in, painting is a great way to, if you paint that, and maintaining the really high quality wood as it starts to break down and wear out and get old, it's more attractive to the carpenter bees. So painting is a big value to minimize them wanting to come in and be there and deter them. You also, it's tricky as far as, but you can also fill in, not when they're in there because they'll get pissed at you. They're mostly docile, but if you start seeing nests, if you start seeing drilling occurring, you could fill them in and stick, people use little tiny dowel rods to fill in areas and block those nests off. It's another option. Deb, do you have other ideas or thoughts?
No, I really like what you say, and I would combine that with what Anonymous suggested, having the painted wood on your house and then having an unpainted, untreated wood, which will be more attractive to the bees, will kind of get them making the choice away from your house and towards something that might work better for everybody.
I love it. Yes.
Awesome. Great information. Thank you for sharing with us. Our next question comes from Carol, and Carol asks, how do you overwinter bees in damp, wet climates? Is it even possible?
So it probably depends on what kind of bee you're talking about. Are you talking about maybe overwintering mason bees? Because I know that most people do that, and that might be what the question is addressing. And so if that is the case, you can take those mason bees really into a cool place that's somewhat sheltered, like your garage, and then they're not dealing with the damp, wet. Make sure you don't want to put them in an unbreathable plastic bag, but really, you know, any permeable kind of container is fine. Some people just do that. Some people clean them out and look for diseased cocoons and throw them away. So if that's what you were talking about, that's the best way to overwinter. As far as the native bees overwintering themselves, then it's providing the shelters that we suggested, because they're going to do the work of finding the nest that has what they need for shelter. And they do it here in our damp, wet climate. As we've said, we're thinking that there's at least 400 and probably closer to 600 native bees who figured out how to live here in Oregon, and they can overwinter in our climate, given that they have the right resources.
And the Xerces Society definitely urges folks to create the areas and the places so that they can overwinter on their own, more than trying to support them in our own potentially a little bit more artificial areas. Leave them to do the work. They know how to do it right. Yeah.
Bees
Awesome.
are really smart. I just want to say that bees are really smart. They have incredible, prodigious memories. They learn from one another. They map out their environment. They're smart. If we give them the resources, they are going to figure it out.
We have so much that we can learn from invertebrates in so many ways, right? I know.
I agree. Let's keep learning about them. Our next question comes from Karen. And Karen asks, is there anything we can do to monitor for bee pathogens on plants, or are those microscopic? How might somebody monitor for bee pathogens on a plant? And is that even possible?
I don't know that it is. That's a great question. We didn't say, I'm the Pesticide Program Director at Xerces. So my background is really more in that realm of, you can test for residues of chemicals on your plants. I don't know about disease. I do know that, there hasn't been information that's shown that like a honeybee that drops off a disease onto a plant, that it's being transferred to some of our solitary bees. We are seeing more of that link between honeybees that are moved around the country, right? And move over long distances, bringing in diseases from other places when they're foraging. And there is transmission to bumblebees. But I don't know if you can actually test the flowers. I think the solution really is being smart about where and when we have honeybees, and not overwhelming an area with too many honeybees, and making sure that, because they will outcompete and they can compete with our native bees and also bring in disease. They're a great thing to have. I love honey. They're amazing for education. I would like to be more like bees that can work together in a whole colony, but being balanced and not having an overload in our urban areas is important to minimize disease issues.
Right on. Thank you for sharing that with us, Aimee. Okay, we've got 2 more questions from our anonymous attendee. And real quick time check, it is 4:58. I can stay on for a few minutes past our end time. I understand folks need to jump off at some point. That's fine. We're recording. We will post this recording to the Beyond Toxics YouTube channel at some point next week. So please follow the Beyond Toxics YouTube channel if you'd like to catch up on this recording at a future date.
And if you
So let's move on. Oh,
and if you have
yeah.
questions for me, you can always, you can find me in email. It's my first name, Aimee, which you can see up on the screen at xerces.org. You could also, if you don't remember that, it's also aimee.code at xerces.org. You'll find me and it's online. I'd be happy to answer questions for folks.
And same here, Schlenoff at msn.com. If you go onto the Lane Audubon Society's website, we're all listed and you can get my information there.
Yay. Okay, so in your opinion, what is your opinion of medicating honeybees in the hive for nosema? I may be pronouncing this wrong, NOSEMA, and other diseases. I look upon it as I would a rabies vaccine for a dog.
Debbie, do you want to answer? We really at Xerces, we really work on native bee issues, and you might have. I could attempt, but you'll probably have a stronger answer than I would.
Yeah, and I don't really, because it is kind of, people have mixed feelings about it. I won't say it's controversial so much as that there's no major agreement on it. We can definitely link you to some beekeeping organizations where I know that they have discussed this, and yeah, there is definitely some benefit to doing something as a preventative kind of thing, like a vaccine. But anytime you're medicating the hive, you might be introducing other issues, you know, based on the chemicals that you're putting in there. So I would want to leave this one to the honeybee keepers who have a lot more experience with this, and not give incomplete or incorrect information here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deb. This next question I think is really interesting, and this is one I'm also super passionate about. Anonymous attendee also asked, they shared with us a few years ago, there was much controversy about flowers sold by big box stores being treated with neonicotinoids. Is it now safe to buy those plants? What about those at garden centers? Where is the best place to buy seeds and plants to ensure that they are untreated with neonics? And I think we dropped some links in the chat that will help you navigate the world of neonic treated plants and plant nurseries, and we can share those again also. But would y'all like to elaborate a little bit on some of the controversies around nursery plants, specifically pollinator plants at those nurseries being treated with neonics, and ways people can avoid doing that and engage in those conversations with native plant nurseries?
I'm going to let Aimee talk a little bit more about the buying Be Safe plants. But before I do that, I just want to give a shout out to Eugene, because the city of Eugene does not use neonic. You know, we've learned so much about the harm that they can do. And I'm really proud to be a part of a community where that has been recognized. So I just had to interject that. Sorry, Aimee, take it away.
That's perfect. And if we're going to have that shout out, we should have a shout out to Beyond Toxics, which is the organization that rallied behind making Eugene a neonic free city, and the first city to go neonic free, which has become a wildfire across the United States. There are dozens of communities across the country that have followed suit. So share the love. I love it. So native plants or nursery plants, was it specific to native plants? I'm not right where that question is, or is it nursery plants?
Not
broadly, right? Because it was
not
stores, right?
Yeah, not specific to native plants, just plants treated with neonics that are sold as pollinator plants at garden centers and plant nurseries.
So the reality is plants that are sold as pollinator plants do not have any particular extra protection on them to protect those pollinators from any of the pesticides that are being used. Industry-wide, I want to be fair to say that there are a number of folks that are working to evaluate the risks of neonics on plants and minimize that risk. And there were, like you said, some of the big box stores took pledges to stop the use of neonicotinoids on some of their pollinator plants. All of that said, the nursery industry still uses a number of pesticides on their plants. And part of that's because we as consumers demand a level of aesthetic and a level of perfection on those plants that doesn't allow for even small amounts of disease. I mean, I'm probably guilty of it when I walk in and I see yellow and something that doesn't look quite right. I'm like, oh, is it not a healthy plant? And so there are quite a few pesticides used in nursery. We actually at Xerces are about to undertake a whole new set of studies on nursery milkweed plants to find out what kind of residues are on them. Last year, we did a very small subset looking mostly in California. We were shocked to find dozens of pesticides on those plants, even plants that were labeled as pollinator friendly. Sometimes they were at levels that could have caused harm. This was in the case we were looking at caterpillars being able to eat the leaves. But other research in Connecticut and across the country has shown that even with the reduction of the neonics in our nurseries, we are still seeing harmful levels. It really is a dialogue. It's going to be a slow process. If you're in your, go into Down to Earth, we know that they're procuring plants that are neonic free, but that's not quite enough. Let's try to urge more organic production of nursery plants. Let's talk to them, have our retailers get plant buyers that are really thoughtful, talking with their commercial nursery about alternative practices to minimize pesticide use, to limit the likelihood that we're going to have contaminated plants. And I think Crystal did stick back in the chat some of those thoughtful questions, some of the ways that you can have that conversation with your nursery. So it's not really good news, but I really feel like there's momentum that we can capitalize on so that our plants are safe.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to ask questions. I mean, you're the one with the wallet, with the money in it, buying the plants. So don't buy something that you're not 100% certain wasn't treated with neonics. And I think that, you have that right as a consumer, and you should be asking those questions about the plants that you're buying for your yard. So don't be afraid to speak up and ask questions, even if the retailers sometimes give you a hard time about it. And go ahead, Aimee.
Well, I just gave a presentation to a group of retail nurseries, and it was very interesting. They were talking about how their clients come in and ask for questions. And it made me realize, they were actually feeling hurt by their clients because the clients would come in and they would demand this or that or the other. And it was actually on a different topic, but to me, it sent the message that we want to have it be a dialogue. We want it to be a friendly dialogue. Their retailers, they're constrained by what they can buy too. So it's a thoughtful back and forth. This is something that's really important to me. Can you be talking with your commercial nurseries about what's being used? No, you don't know if neonics were applied. Can you call them and find out? This is, anyway. It sounded like, a little bit of sugar goes a lot longer. What is the sugar versus vinegar attracting? What's that little phrase go?
You attract more flies with honey than you do vinegar. I think I got that right.
I don't know if that's the right comparison or not, but be nice. It was interesting to see these retailers were feeling hurt by their clients when the clients were upset with them. So that was it. Anyway. Yeah. A lot of questions.
Okay.
And I am a mom with a kid and I've got to zip in a few minutes. So.
Okay. So can I keep you for one more question? Okay, great. So our last question that we're going to get to today, and we're going to save all the rest of the questions and work on answering them and posting them with our recording. So if we didn't get to your question, we'll get to it in the YouTube recording. Our last question tonight comes from Melissa, and Melissa asks, how much does tilling impact bees? Would tilling every 2 or 3 years rather than every year help to maintain beautiful butterfly pupas and ground nesting bees? And also, what should you do if you accidentally dig up a pupa?
So tilling does have negative impacts, and we definitely, one of the things we want to do when we're thinking globally about agriculture, besides getting away from monoculture, besides making sure that there's wildflowers to support native pollinators, is thinking about no-till agriculture. It's just bad for the soil, bad for the beneficial microorganisms that live in the soil, and yes, bad for butterfly and bee, ground nesting bees. So anything that you can do to reduce tilling, like doing it every 2 or 3 years rather than every year, would certainly be an improvement. What should you do if you accidentally dig one up? Well, if you think that you haven't caused it any harm, you can kind of try sticking it right back in. It doesn't always work. It could be that you've disturbed it, and you might even have triggered an early emergence, but sometimes you can get away with it, and you can get it back there in the ground and cover it up, with a little bit of the dirt where you found it in, and it'll be just fine until it's ready to emerge. So it's worth a try.
Yeah, no, chiming in, I agree with Debbie, trying to minimize tillage as much as possible, or also, and if you feel that is necessary, going at a lower depth, but recognizing even beyond all of these macro invertebrates, we have all these amazing soil invertebrates that are also, or not even to mention like the cool beetles that you could find in the soils. There's so many reasons not to want to till, because it disturbs those whole soil ecosystems. There's a big effort in the Midwest to minimize tillage as much as been, it also, of course, for erosion and other issues.
I'm just going to really quickly answer the next question, if you don't mind, Roseanne, because it's just really new research, and they have been looking at the after effects of the wildfires in our area. And it turns out that wildfires are actually good for bees. Obviously, the ones that are really hot and extensive aren't that great, but bees have evolved with naturally occurring wildfires, and the wildfires that were controlled burning, as the indigenous people use. And it's good for them because it sort of clears out an area, lots of sunshine, and then that helps to promote the little flowers that the bees then rely on. So we don't think of wildfire as necessarily being bad for bees, and the research on that has been reassuring. But again, we want to cut down the extensive and intensive wildfires as they now exist.
I'm going to slip off, but I did see one question, and please forgive me. I saw a question, it's not in order, but I just wanted to quick answer it because I thought it was a great question. It was about what we term preemption, pesticide preemption. So a number of states, it was actually a concerted effort by a group called ALEC, and throughout the country, we have states that do not allow local governments to regulate pesticide use on private property. And right now in Minnesota, there is an effort to take a narrow slice and remove some of that preemption effort in order to better protect pollinators and minimize some pesticide, specifically concerning pesticide uses on private property. So someone asked about how can we make that change, because Eugene right now cannot regulate private property, pesticide use on private property. This is state legislation. This is why you have Crystal and I on the call. Let's, talk about this for next session. Can we take a slice out of preemption? It's something that happened in it was in the mid 90s. It was so disappointing. It was a rider on a transportation bill that everyone wanted. And so they pushed it through in order to get the transportation bill they wanted through. And here we are stuck without being able to regulate. So contact us, right, Crystal? You don't like, Beyond Toxics doesn't like preemption.
Oh no. We could have a whole webinar about preemption, and thank you for the great Q&A to help us plan more of these bee webinars coming up. So it sounds like we might want to have a webinar specifically addressing that, especially before the legislature begins next session. So thank you. I just want to give one more thank you to our phenomenal speakers. I wish we had an audience to applaud you, but feel free to throw your applause in the chat and just show some love for our speakers that took time to be here with us today and share their words of wisdom with us. And we look forward to seeing some of you at the in-person bee count on April 28th. And we'll be out in the Alton Baker Park, actually getting our hands dirty with some of these lovely bees that we just talked about today. So thank you again for being with us, Debbie and Aimee. Y'all are awesome. It was an honor to host you. And thank you to our attendees who stuck around late with us to learn more. So any parting words you'd like to say them now, and we'll end the webinar and go have a great rest of our day.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Aimee. Thank you for people who are interested in helping us. Thanks for being here. And enjoy spring.
Yay!
Thanks, guys.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Feel free to email if you have further questions if we couldn't get to you. Bye, everybody.